This is a project that the town has been working on now for a couple of years. We bought the home 3 years ago and began just basically shoring up the home and just trying to do what we could just to kind of keep it at its place until we could get funding for renovating the home as best we can. We hired Lee Ingram with Brewer Ingram Fuller Architects about a year ago now, and we had an ad hoc committee that we got together and started working on what kind of uses we thought that would be good for the structure. One of the things we realized going through that process is nobody had a real clear idea of what they thought the best approach would be. And so in talking to the board and talking to the committee, we wanted to look at just renovating part of the home at this point, and Lee is going to get into all those details in a moment, but be able to at least get the public in the home so they could start giving us their feedback on what they like and what they think would be good fits for the home and the property going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Lee. Lee has been working on this. He's got some cost estimates for us tonight, and we'll go over the scope of the project at this time.
Thanks, David. Thank you for having me tonight. I don't think this is on, is it? Does that matter? Can you hear me?
Can you pull it up a little bit?
It is on?
Yeah, it should be. Can you pull it up a little bit?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. I appreciate your time tonight to hear our results of our study, and thank you for the introduction. I can't take but a small percentage of credit for the work on this project because we have a big team of people that have worked on this. And you can't see the slides that we have prepared. Oh, they're on your screen. Okay, good. Well, that's a relief. But this is a list of the people who are on the study team. Our firm, and Aaron Streeter here with me representing our firm tonight. Ross Fowler, and they're our landscape architect. Mike Fowler and David Craig are here tonight to address some of the site design issues. Bender and Associates, the structural engineer, and Rob Hauser is here with us tonight to talk about some of the structural questions and issues at the house. Bettinger Consulting Engineers was our go-to on HVAC, plumbing, and fire protection. And Vreeland Engineers, Chuck Luttrell, worked with us on electrical engineering. And we were very fortunate to get Mark Holcomb on our team as the cost estimator. Mark used to be with Johnson & Gallion, and he now does independent cost estimating. And he's had quite a lot of experience in this type of project. So it's a little bit of a tricky science to estimate historic preservation sometimes, and Mark is good at that. So we were glad to have him involved. We only have 25 slides, and we'll go through them very quickly, and then we'll stay around for questions. Feel free to stop us at any point in the presentation if you'd like to ask something. The first slide I started off with, this is actually language verbatim out of our agreement with the town of Farragut, and I just put that in there as a reminder to me to mention that this project that we're working on now is a very preliminary study phase and planning phase, and it really has two tracks. One was to study the inn itself and make recommendations on its stabilization, and the other one was the planning of the site, a master plan for the site, because in our RFQ there was a request to include some additional development on that property besides the inn itself. So part of our services was to look at that and come up with what we believed was not the maximum development of the site, but the optimum development of the site, considering that the significance of that property goes back to the 1700s, really before the inn was even constructed. The inn that's there now was even constructed. The first thing we did, our team did, was an assessment phase, and the structural engineer went through and looked at what they could visually. There were no destructive tests or anything like that done, no x-rays. The mechanical engineer went through and looked at the existing mechanical and plumbing systems, and the electrical did the same for electrical. And I can tell you that the 2 pages on the right consist of the entire reports from the electrical and mechanical. And in a nutshell, they said, you don't want to use any of the things that are in here now. You need to stop using them. So, and Rob is here if you want to say anything about what you found. And okay.
Good evening. Basically, this inn is pretty indicative of a property that's been neglected for quite a while. Beginning at the roof, the roof is constructed of 2x4s, which is pretty light, as you all know if you're in the building industry. And some of the roofs and the floors are sagging toward the middle. What that looks like it's from is in the basement, where everything is supported off of a couple of bearing walls. If you've seen pictures of that basement, it's the walls are in pretty bad shape. The mortar is very powdery and easy to remove. The 2 main bearing walls are dilapidated and somewhat collapsing. And I think what is causing the main distress in the inn is that central bearing. Everything is kind of sagging toward the middle. So that's it in a nutshell. Really, the exterior pieces that we're removing may have some adverse effect on what is there now, so we'll have to make sure we carefully deconstruct what's there now. So I don't think it's unsalvageable, but there's quite a bit of work to be done to stabilize this thing. So.
And actually, after Rob finished his assessment, he suggested that some temporary shoring be done in the basement, which was done, just really probably a year ago or maybe even a little more. The town had some other studies done that we were not a part of. One was an archaeological study that I believe UT did, and also an environmental assessment, not only of the inn, but of that milk barn building behind it. And that was to look for hazardous materials. And I think, Mike, are you going to speak for your group?
Yes.
Mike is going to talk a little bit about the site and setting of the house and the master plan.
Well, one of the major ideas, beginning with our first visits to the site, was we have a site with the house in a prominent location. Some of the original trees are there. Some of the original topography is still left, although much of it was changed because of the widening of Kingston Pike. But we felt like there was a possibility of establishing a setting that would be respectful for the house and act as a core of Farragut. Some of the things that we have seen in the Knoxville area are up on the screen, and these were mistakes made by others. The Baker Peters house on Kingston Pike, I'm sure most of you are familiar with that house. It has suffered from ill-conceived additions to the house, and it has a commercial facility in its front yard. So we would consider that the historic setting of the Baker Peters house has been destroyed. States View was a victim of the widening of the street. Actually, our firm was called in back then, and we built the wall and planted a barrier and did what we could to salvage the setting of States View, and it's moderately successful. Knollwood, many of you remember when Knollwood's front yard was a beautiful sloping lawn. Today you can hardly see Knollwood in that slide. It's peeking out from the trees in the back. an unfortunate change in that whole site. The Walker Sherrill House is a brand new travesty. The house was saved only to suffer its context and setting to be emasculated by a commercial structure and by a rocked stormwater detention basin in its front yard. What we would like to see with the CampStaInn project is that enough of the setting is preserved and that there is a compromise between the commercial use of the site and the historic setting of the CampStaInn. One example that Lee's firm and our firm worked on in downtown Knoxville is the Park House, and this is an example of a sensitive architectural addition to a historic property. From the site, we were able to insert some parking to reestablish lawn and a natural setting for this historic structure that's located in downtown Knoxville. When we really started to work on the CampStaInn project, we established our opinion of the view shed. We can sort of see an aerial of the CampStaInn project above in the slide. If I can get my pointer in the right place, the house is right here, and this drawing beneath is our first ideas of where the view shed for the house would be. There is a view shed both from Kingston Pike eastbound and an impressive view shed of the house from Campbell Station Road southbound. So our proposal is that about a half of the site would be thought of as the setting or the view shed of the house. This idea was first put forth in earlier planning studies for the town, where the house was incorporated into a development plan for the surrounding properties, but the house itself was accorded different positions within that study, and here are a couple of them, but in most cases the corner remained green in previous planning studies. When it came time for us to do a draw out of the plan, we were very aware that we needed to provide the setting of the house, and I'll show you the view shed again, which is diagonal across, and that we wanted the setting of the house to also not interfere or influence too greatly the commercial possibilities of other structures on the site. So the master plan shows, I have to refresh my memory about the square footages. The house itself is about 1,600 square feet per floor, so that's 3,200 square feet of space there. The two buildings that are behind the house or north of the house are approximately 2,400 square feet per floor, so 4,800 square feet per building, for a total square footage on the site of 12,800 square feet. Your parking ordinance requires about 28 spaces of parking. That plan shows 40 spaces of parking and manages to leave the corner green. And in this form, we envision a sort of a town green that is closely tied to the CampStaInn property. We believe this kind of approach allows the site to be commercially developed and yet the historic property itself to retain its setting and a byproduct of that would be a new green open space in the core of the town of Farragut.
I think that the parking areas that are shown as a darker color too are going to be
They're paper parking lots, so
Yeah.
they're both sustainable in terms of stormwater, and they'll have a pedestrian nature so that they could easily convert to a festival or event kind of setting where the green spaces are supplemented by paved spaces acting as sort of a plaza for the town.
Would you like me to repeat that? Okay. The darker parking areas are a paver surface that also has a pedestrian feel, so that central parking area could actually be closed off and used as a festival space for outdoor events. There's also a little tiny brown square just to the north of the northwest of the building there that is a small restroom building, and I'll talk about that again in a second. But Mike and David, I think, had all the fun on this project developing the master plan, and Rob and we got to work down in the basement and so forth. But there, as David Smoke mentioned, there were other meetings with other consultants besides us to discuss the usage of the building, and those went on really separately from our work. I'm aware of 3 different people that came in and talked to the committee, one from Tusculum College, a museum studies professor, the executive director of Ramsey House, and a developer from Hatcher Hill all came in and consulted with the committee over what would be the highest and best use of the inn itself. And we also introduced to the group the technical aspects of the National Park Service's guidelines and standards for preservation that are applicable to historic structures, especially those on the National Register. So all of these things came into play as the town pondered what would be the best way to go forward with the inn. And I got a call from David Smoke one day, and he said, well, we want to stabilize it, and here are the things we'd like to do. And he gave me a list of things, and that they were kind of an initial phase to get the building sturdy again and get it buttoned up and get it looking good, and not necessarily occupiable in that it would be ready for daily use, but get it so that, say on weekends, groups could be taken through for tours to see what it was like inside. And so it would be a kind of an interim stabilization phase. It wouldn't be occupied in a technical sense. In other words, it wouldn't have a certificate of occupancy from the town. And we did meet with John Householder and Mark and talked about these plans, and we came up with a good interim plan, I think, for the building. And the idea is that in the future, it would be offices and possibly museum on the first floor and the basement level, maybe offices for the whole building. So we approached it in a way that it could follow either of those paths. The scope of stabilization, demolition of most of the later additions to the original block, and it says most because for the time being we're keeping the front porch and the back porch. Structural bracing, replacing the chimneys that are not there anymore, although they would not be functional chimneys, they would be ornamental. Re-roofing with a more appropriate material, removing the old plumbing and electrical that really aren't serviceable anymore, cleaning out deteriorated interior finishes. Right now you have modern wallpaper that's kind of peeling off the walls and that sort of thing, carpet that doesn't need to be in there. Limited repointing of the masonry, And as Rob mentioned earlier, repointing deteriorated walls within the basement and rebuilding them in some cases where they are kind of losing their ability to support. Restoring the windows and the original exterior doors, putting in new HVAC systems, and again, those would be designed really for office use and, if necessary, augmented later for museum use, so there's not a lot of difference in the pattern of HVAC design for that since the building is not very big. And then a minimal new electrical system, basically alarms, emergency lighting, and a few plugs. When we met with John and Mark, we talked about what effect does it have on things like accessibility to the building, sprinklering the building if we're not planning to permanently occupy it yet. And some decisions were made. The building would be classified business occupancy for code purposes. Accessibility would not be required since it's really not going to be permanently occupied, although before it is permanently occupied, obviously the minimum accessibility requirements that are in ADA for historic structures would need to be met, which are primarily that you should be able to park, get into the main level of the building, and use the restroom. So those are part of the master plan that you saw earlier. In the meantime, portable accessible toilets can be used whenever the town has the building open. In the future, we have proposed that rather than use up what really little floor space there is in the end for accessible toilets, which take up quite a bit of space, that those be built in a separate, very small building. That was the little square on the master plan. We believe that it can be 2 unisex toilets that are accessible, and those could also be opened up for outdoor events, so people could use those without going into the inn itself. And we would leave one of the bathrooms on the upper level. We would restore that and make it functional. It would not be an accessible bathroom, but it would be a convenience toilet within the inn itself. And we believe that that strategy would do the most to preserve the historic fabric of the building. We did decide to estimate a sprinkler system in the building, not necessarily because it was required by code at the time, but it's much easier to put it in during the stabilization phase, and it protects the cultural asset. A lot of times you can lose an irreplaceable building because of a careless fire, and the sprinkler system is certainly the best way to help prevent something like that. These diagrams are impossible to read from a distance. I realize that. The orange colored blocks are pieces that are coming off in this phase. The dark colored blocks are extra additions that we are keeping just in the stabilization phase. The light blue strip at the bottom is the footprint of the porch, the Greek Revival porch that you've seen in the photographs, that would be reconstructed, not in this phase, but in a future phase.
How many phases do you envision?
That is really entirely up to you, and I have a little list of what happens next that I'll go through, and then we could discuss, if you'd like, how you might see breaking that up into future phases. It could be 2, it could be 3.
Okay.
It just depends on budgeting.
Just for the building part, just for the house?
It would be better if it were 2. It would be easier and probably cheaper in the long run if it were just 2 phases. Okay. Yeah. In this plan, the room on the bottom right, which is the southeast corner, would also be restored to a period appearance as a kind of a sample of what could be done with the rest of the house, so that when you take folks in to see the building, they can get excited to see what the whole place could look like from one sample room. On the lower level, again, these are the footprints of the pieces that would come off. If a museum is put in. We believe that this level should be interpreted as part of the tour, and because the kitchen for the inn was in the basement, and we would like to see that interpreted as any kind of a museum tour. We would use part of the basement for mechanical space and so forth. And then the upper level, there's that restroom I was talking about that we would renovate and make usable. The chimneys, you can see the blocks of the chimneys there, those would be rebuilt. And then the roof, I think we mentioned earlier that the roof would be replaced as part of this. There aren't that many photographs that we know of that show the original chimneys. We have pictures that are more recent that show chimneys, but the tops of the chimneys have changed over time. So we took the earliest photo we could find of the chimneys and we blew it up and did our best to determine the coursing of the brick on the chimneys so that could be estimated for reconstruction. And then those would have caps on them. They would not be operable.
I had a question about that. Why are we not going to have operable fireplaces?
Well, if you want to have operable fireplaces, that is another expense that we can look at. At the Park House, we put in gas logs in the fireplaces, and we did make those chimneys operable, so it can be done. But the decision that we had received in the programming stage from the committee was that they would not be operable because it is a kind of a tricky expense. And you have to reline the chimneys, and it's not just a matter of sprucing them up. It's quite a bit of work.
Right.
And Alderman, I think the other thing we had just a concern about was obviously having a live fire in the home with the people in and out of the inn, not necessarily being there full time or living there full time to watch something like that. Having embers spark a fire, was certainly a concern from a liability standpoint. So that's why, at least right now, we've talked about not doing it. We certainly can, but it's not something that we initially thought to put that as a operable fireplace.
I don't think that rebuilding them would preclude you from converting them later on, but if you thought that was a possibility, it would be nice to let us know before that work's done, and we might be able to go ahead and do some of that work as part of this project.
Sure. It'd be easier to access at this point.
Yes. Yes, it would. Do you want me to keep talking, Mike, or do you want to do this one? Well, we realized that there needed to be kind of an interim site plan for this stabilization phase, and we understood that the town wanted to keep some kind of vehicle loop through the site, and so you see a driveway there, which is really just a matter of demolishing all the pavement around the driveway to leave a strip of asphalt to drive through there. But in this phase, the rest of the asphalt paving, with the exception of a small parking area off of Kingston Pike, would be removed, and the milk barn would be removed. And then you can also see the additions to the inn removed in that diagram. So quite a lot of removal going on the site. And then those site areas would be stabilized and regrassed just as part of this project, and that's included in the estimate. So before the estimate could be done, we had to go back to those same engineers and say, okay, now you need to write a scope of work for estimating to get this project to the level of stabilization that the town has requested. And the mechanical engineer came up with the different unit sizes and described the sprinkler system and so forth. The electrical engineer and I think you have these documents, gave a written scope of the minimal electrical work that would be required. And the bigger report was Rob's report again. And do you want to expound a little bit on that? Or?
So in a stabilization phase for this project is really, the structural part is going to have to just about be the whole project. It's hard to stabilize part of it now and part of it later. So what our intent was to come in and reinforce the main floor and reinforce the foundation. We're going to tuck point some of the mortar, probably most of the mortar in the basement, as it's in pretty bad shape, and then rebuild those walls, reinforce the floor. Now the second floor is covered by finishes. There's a possibility there could be some damage or deterioration in the first upper level. That might be something that might have to be done later, but my understanding is the slopes in those floors, we'll try to jack some of that out as much as we can without doing some damage, but I'm not sure we can get it completely flat and level like it was when it was built, or we assume it was when it was built. The upper floor is going to be something that we'll have to study. The stairs, the temporary support for the stair where it's sagging, I'm thinking we're going to put in temporary column support for it until we can get more finishes removed and study how that's framed, because that could be kind of tricky. So for the temporary stabilization, we'll put in a post where that's sagging that will come down into the basement. Now the basement framing will all be as it will be when it's completed. The attic and roof, yes.
So you talk about the temporary support for the stairs. Are you meaning through phase one, that will be where it is until we decide to move along to the rest of it? Okay.
Yes. The main bottom floor will all be fully done. The stair, we'll put a temporary support in until we get to that next phase. The roof, I think, will more than likely will be a complete repair, restore. I don't know if you're putting new plywood on the roof. We're going to stabilize the roof by adding some support inside the attic. We'll brace the existing rafters. We will add ceiling joists, sister them up to help. You'll build a knee wall off of those to support the rafters, and I think we will provide bracing for the end walls, some diagonal bracing, so that when another storm comes, hopefully that won't push the wall in like we had before, and we'll tie all that roof together with hurricane clips and make that roof a little bit more stable structure. The outside has some cracks that we can tuck point and fix. Some of the cracks may or may not be due to some settlement. I don't know if we hadn't had geotech look at this yet, but we may have a geotechnical engineer come around and probe a little bit and see if we have soils issues or if we've got brick expansion, things like that.
Can I ask you a real quick question? In insulation, I see we're not going to do any roof insulation, but it does say we're going to do some attic insulation. Why one and not the other?
Well, that's a Lee question, but that's okay. But
Okay.
I'm just about finished. But the exterior walls will have some crack repair, possibly some foundation stabilization if we find that we've got some bad soils. I haven't been over there lately, but with this drought, we've seen a lot of soil shrinkage and some cracking in homes. I've been to 3 this week. So, now that we've got some rain, that'll help a little bit, but that's something to watch for if you've got some soils issues. So with that, I'll give that to Lee.
I think Mark's estimating form has standard lines in it to remind him to price things, and on some buildings the thermal envelope is actually up at the sloped roof level, but at the end the thermal envelope is at the ceiling of the second floor. So the attic insulation is all you need.
I have a question for you too. The house, if I remember right, I was in it one time, has 2 front to back cross walls, masonry walls. And in one of those walls there was some evident, looked like compression of the wall. The wall had actually settled downward, and there were sloping lintels and the doors that penetrated it and so forth. And I looked at it. I'm a builder, I'm a contractor by profession. And I wondered, what do you do about something like that? So have y'all taken that into consideration? I didn't notice a specific line item there, but what are we doing about that?
Well, that's exactly what Rob was talking about when he was talking about internal sagging and potentially trying to jack some of that up, but not to the extent that we would crack and damage something. In some cases, on historic buildings, you try to hold what you have rather than try to make it perfect again, because you can damage things by trying to make them
Right.
good as new. That's the case. There were two issues, if I recall. One was there was a lack of support beam in the center, which is one reason that temporary shoring was put in.
Right.
The other is that those same walls you mentioned, if you take them down all the way to the basement, in some cases they're very, very deteriorated.
Right.
And we think that there's some issues because of that as well.
I believe that's the case. I mean, it's just those two main support walls really need to be rebuilt and pushed up a little bit to help support that upper level.
In the basement.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. And how do you do that?
Yeah.
Well, there's going to be some shoring, temporary shoring involved that's going to have to take place as well during that construction period.
Yeah, no doubt. Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Well, in a very cursory sort of way, I mean, technically how you do that, how you shore up a crumbling brick wall and raise the masonry structure above it while you reinsert, you know, what holds it up while you're doing that. So that's interesting. I'm just curious about that.
Piece at a time.
Yeah.
Usually, you know, you may take some steel channels and bolt them through the wall and post them up through the floor to help hold the upper wall while the lower one's getting built. We've done that before. That's a way. But we
Great.
haven't done into a deep study of how to do that yet.
Okay.
That's the concept.
All right. Thank you.
Although I don't recall seeing anything that you haven't seen before, I mean, in terms of,
No,
yeah.
it could be done.
Yeah.
I just threw this slide in from another project just as a reminder to mention that we are planning on doing a period restoration of one of those rooms, and it'll be fun to do that. I think we'll work with the committee to decide at what period we want to go to for the inn. If you're putting the front porch back on, we think it was probably built somewhere between 1850 and 1890, something like that, based on just its style. If you want to spend the money to do a paint analysis and finishes analysis, we can suggest a conservator to come in and actually do authentic research so that you can put in original colors. Some people want to do that and some really don't want to find out, just in case they don't like what they see. The exit sign, just kind of a reminder that we don't just throw Home Depot exit signs in buildings like this. We try to be sensitive to those sorts of things. Okay, the first estimate I have up here is just a summary of the stabilization for the building itself. This doesn't include really any site work. It does include the demolition associated with the inn, but it doesn't include the demolition of the milk barn. And you should have a breakdown, line item breakdown of where these numbers came from. It ended up being about, I think it was $148 a square foot, which is pretty typical for what we see for these sorts of projects. As Rob mentioned, most of the structural work for the project would be done in this phase. So I think what you're seeing here is a lot of structural and envelope work. And HVAC, really, because you're going to have fully functioning HVAC systems when this project is finished. The demolition of the milk barn and all of the site work associated with that black and white site stabilization plan I showed you a minute ago, that's what this estimate is for. None of these estimates include hazardous abatement. That's supposed to be done before these projects begin under a separate agreement. So if you add both estimates together, we think it's about a $900,000 project to get this up to the point that we've discussed. There are some exclusions in the estimate. These are normal kinds of exclusions. You know, they don't know whether there's any rock to remove around the building. I guess they assume the building permit would maybe the town won't have to buy a permit from itself, that sort of thing. So just general kinds of exclusions. It's when I sent the estimate to Gary, I sent him a cover email with it, and it said things like there could be additional discoveries made during construction document phase which could affect the costs. Market conditions are subject to change. These estimates are not bids or guaranteed maximum prices. Construction cost estimates typically don't include things like furnishings and utility connection fees and design fees and that sort of thing. So just to clarify that this is a construction cost estimate. The next steps, hazardous materials abatement would be probably the very next step. And I think Gary's been working on that process. And then as far as our design team is concerned, if the mayor and board decide to move forward, our next step would be construction documents for this stabilization phase project. And back to the earlier question about how many phases and so forth. After the stabilization phase is complete, assuming that it moves forward, then what happens? And I think, again, we're looking at a site project and an end project. For the site, one thing would be to adopt that master plan that Mike presented and then prioritize that master plan for implementation. Decide which pieces of it you want to do first. Move ahead with those perimeter roads that were shown straddling the property lines, which I think maybe the town has an agreement with the adjacent property owners about that anyway. So that would be one step. Moving ahead with the remaining site development, the little toilet building, and the grading, the park, the parking, the new building, whether you want to build it all at once or in two pieces. It actually was laid out in a way that it could be phased very easily if you wanted to just build half of it. And then for the inn, I think it would be wonderful if with your media types at the town, if you could put out an all call for any citizen to come forward that might have photographs of the inn, historic or older photos, because we have a very limited database of historic imagery here. So I don't know if somebody has a cedar chest in their attic or something that has some old family photos in it that might have this building in the background maybe, but we would love to have those. Finalizing the program for the usage of the inn. In other words, okay, it's offices, but for whom and what will they be doing there? And if it will have a museum in it, what will be in the museum? Those sorts of things. Finalizing the design of the inn interiors and all of the services accordingly based on the final usage. Finalizing the immediate site around the inn, the parking, access, accessibility, and developing the reconstruction designs for the front and rear porches, which would be a very fun thing to do. And then finally just moving ahead with completion of the inn to place it in service. And that could be one big phase. It could be broken out into pieces and developed over time just as the town sees fit. So I think I went way longer than I intended to, and I apologize, but we're here if you have questions.
I think board members, what we're trying to do is obviously give you an update of where we've been, but also determine if the board would like to try to at least step in the same direction of going forward with the stabilization phase of the inn. Right now, we've got $1.4 million set aside for this for this whole entire project. Obviously, he's given you the estimate for that. We've probably spent roughly $75,000 to $100,000 so far. With all the different studies and the contracts that we have thus far on the property. So we do have the available funds to probably move forward with this section. Now, what Lee did mention was we do have an agreement with White Realty to put in the roads into Village Green, and that would connect our property to Village Green, which was an asset really to both of us. helps have better access to and from Kingston Pike and Campbell Station, but also gives us overflow parking for any kind of big events we may have that can park in the Village Green Center. So that'll be coming up in next year's CIP. That's something we'll have to do. We have a 3-year window to get that project done. So just as a FYI on things that are coming down the road for this piece of property.
I've got a question. In the one drawing, you said all the gray asphalt would be taken out except for one access road, I believe. And then you mentioned that would be part of this phase. And then you mentioned something about grading. Is the entire lot, the entire 2 acres, going to be graded for future use, or just the removal of the asphalt?
Just the removal of the asphalt and the remedy to get that area so it will drain properly and have vegetation on it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Lee. Appreciate all your work on this, and thank you so much, and we'll definitely be getting back with you here soon.
Thank you, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to serve you.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chair Board, our next workshop item tonight is a discussion of development impact fees. This is an area that we talked about several months back, and we wanted to come back tonight and give you an update on where we're at. Obviously, we probably don't have enough time to get into everything tonight, but we did want to at least revisit this item for you since it has been a while since we got into this. Since the town's incorporation in 1980, we've been working with developers to build out our town according to our adopted land use plan, our zoning ordinances, subdivision regulations, stormwater regulations, and our major road and pedestrian plan. All of these plans go into making our town the great community it is today. And without those plans, I dare say that we wouldn't see the high quality of development or the high quality of citizens that we've been able to recruit here to our town of Farragut. All the infrastructure and amenities that we provide the community certainly come with costs associated to them. One of the challenges that any community has to deal with is how to pay for those services with the limited resources that are available to us. For decades now, the town has approved many new developments in our town, as is evident from the population increasing from roughly 6,000 citizens back in 1980 to 22,600 today. Over that time, some developments occurred on roads that were improved to the town's standards, and others located in areas where roads needed improvements to be made to accommodate the increased traffic that would be generated from the new development. In those cases, the town has typically reached cost share agreements with developers, and depending on the improvements to be made, developers have done anything from pay for all the cost of improvements to constructing just small segments that would need to be connected in order to make the pieces fit from one area to the next. Typically, though, these cost share agreements require the developers to pay 2/3 of the cost of the road and construction improvements, and the town would pay 1/3 of the cost of those improvements. What was evident, though, is that there was no real consistent method to quantify these costs and no consistency or predictability for a developer to know what their upfront costs would be for the road improvements. Back in 2014, we took a step in this direction when the town adopted a corridor fee for the Everett Road area. This provided for a fixed fee per dwelling unit and currently has 2 developments ongoing in the area. What this also did was shift the greater burden of paying for the road improvements from the developer to the town, as the town will now be paying roughly 60% of the cost and the developers 40% for this section of the roadway. The town then went on to contract with Duncan and Associates, whose firm has done hundreds of impact fee studies for cities across the country, to further review the remaining roadways we have in town that are substandard and will eventually need to be improved. They held a series of public meetings earlier this year to get feedback from those in attendance, and I presented a final report, which Gary's going to be covering with you in further detail here in just a few minutes. The workshop tonight is really just being conducted so we can review the study again, since it has been several months since we got together on this, and also for the board to be able to have any questions answered, and if need be, get additional information from our consultant if appropriate. The feedback the BMA gives us will be important so staff can continue to refine the issue further so we can bring back the additional information at a future workshop. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Gary and let him walk through the study with you, and we'll try to answer any questions that we have of the board tonight.
Thanks, David. This will be a brief PowerPoint. I'll try to capture the main items. Some of the stuff may be redundant from what David just said, so let's jump right in. So why impact fees? Finding alternative funding sources was identified as a priority in the strategic plan. There is a desire, I think, on both sides, the town and the development side, to have some sort of predictability, as David talked about, in our ordinance and our requirements. Makes things easier, more consistent, and more defendable if we ever get challenged in court. Impact fees can provide alternatives for funding and also provide that predictability. Again, we contracted with the consultant, Duncan Associates, and have completed a series of public meetings and gathered comment. This slide just kind of goes through the history a little bit. So pre-2014, we negotiated the cost share agreements, and then we adopted the Everett Road improvement fee, which kind of serves as a little bit of a template for what we see in the study under the corridor approach. Now we're obviously exploring alternatives for revenue and the impact fees. So according to the study, the town needs to identify what they call a service area. The service area creates that nexus between the development and the actual improvement. And there's, for our purposes, the study identifies two different types of service areas. One would be the corridor zonal-based fee, and the other is a town-wide fee. So the corridor fee, a couple highlights: it applies only to new development, as with the town-wide fee, but it identifies the developments within the benefit zones. You see that picture. Those blue bubbles are the identified benefit zones, and these were identified by Corradino, who worked with Duncan Associates on this. And if you look inside those bubbles, you see different roads. Boring's got its own. You see Everett, Evans, Allen Kirby. The way that we calculate those costs will be totaling all the costs of the roads within that benefit zone, and then determining based on land use the number of new trips that the proposed development will contribute to that benefit zone. Different from the town-wide approach, and conversely, the town-wide approach is the entire town is considered the service area. So any fees that we collect, if we decide to do this, can be used town-wide. Any fees we collect on the corridor, zonal-based, have to be used within that benefit area. And here's the formula for both. Total improvement cost divided by the estimated future trips equals the cost per trip. And then you multiply that, trips per day, and it equals your cost per dwelling unit. And you see at the bottom the asterisk, I have these numbers, the trip generation numbers are from the ITE manual. Is that correct, Daryl?
That's correct.
So here's an example, the Everett Road example for the corridor approach. So the cost share example, the Everett Road corridor fee was based on a conservative estimate of $1,815,000. So that translates into $6,241 per dwelling unit. So this amount paid per this is the amount that was paid per dwelling unit at the time of the individual permitting for that dwelling unit. I know it's a little confusing. The actual full cost of the improvements, which provides for 12-foot wide lanes, a 6-foot sidewalk, and a 60-foot right-of-way, was $3,274,042. This number is consistent with the cost estimates that were provided for in the study, or provided in the study. The Everett Road corridor fee calculations used only 55% of the full actual cost of the road improvement. If the full actual cost of the improvement had been used, the fee would have been $11,258 per dwelling unit. Thus, 45% of the total cost of Everett Road was covered by the town through the CIP. This slide, this table just indicates the cost of the road. on the different elements of that cost, if you want to take a second to digest that a little bit.
Gary, can you go back real quick? I think, Mayor and Board, the main thing to take from this slide is we've got all the roads in town that that are substandard and need to be improved. And that total amount right now is $52 million, and that's in current dollars and current values today.
So this table reflects the fee by land use. Office is lumped in with commercial in this category. And you can see the different charges based on the type of land use. Obviously, commercial is much more, office is much more. So these are the things we need to consider. So this kind of goes back to the commercial. So this table illustrates what we would be paying if we were to waive commercial in different portions. So it shows if we give a 50% waiver, the total improvement cost of $52 million, we would pay roughly $20 million of that. And then you have the 100% waiver, we would pay the entire cost of that for commercial. So really, just to wrap it up, the overall points to consider when you guys are deliberating over this, or we need to determine the service area if we're going to move forward. Do we do a corridor approach, a zonal approach with those benefit areas, or do we do a townwide approach where the entire town is the service area? We need to determine which land uses are going to be subject to the fee. Are we going to omit commercial? Are we going to subsidize commercial? What are we going to do with that? And if we do adopt it, do we include developments that were platted before the adoption but not permitted? And as a final note, as proposed, regardless of which approach, the town is still going to be funding this at some level. So it's not a full cost of the developer. We're still doing a cost share. We're just doing it in a more uniform manner. So that's all I had. If you had any questions about the study, I'll try to answer them or get an answer for you.
Gary, can you go back to the benefit zones?
Bigger slide.
Yeah.
So we have Dixon Road in its own benefit zone. So we have what? 1, 2, 3, 5?
This is conceptual and potential. I think as the consultant looked at all these zones, the consultant recommended the townwide approach. I think the reason for that is because the cost per dwelling unit would be much lower if you do a townwide approach rather than doing the zonal approach. Certainly, we can always look at these zones and you can probably merge them together in different ways if that's what we need to do. But I'm assuming that he just looked at Dixon as a separate area in and of itself because it is a shorter piece of roadway and really already had a link to an improved road with Old Stage right there at the northern boundary.
Okay. My concern with the benefit zonal is, I know with the corridor fee that we established in Everett Road, you have a time frame within which you need to finish that road. With the benefit zone, are you basically in the same position where you have to finish all those roads in a certain amount of time?
Yeah, I mean, there's case law that talks about, and if you remember when we were going back and forth, we were trying to determine what that timeline was, and I think we came up with 10 years.
Yeah.
That we had to spend that money within 10 years or refund it.
But obviously, if you have a larger zone with several roads in it and you're making progress towards that, I think that certainly as long as we're working on the roads in those zones, then that's part of that whole process. Now, if you don't do anything in that 10-year period, then yes, that would be a problem. It's something we'd probably have to rebate the developer back funds for anything that we received in over that time period.
Could we take the lower zone, the larger circle there, and make that 4 zones? Is that what you're saying? We could possibly do that?
You're talking about including Dixon and with Allen Kirby?
No, I'm just saying Kirby, could that be a zone? Evan Road be a zone? Virtual be a zone? Is that?
All of them could be, yes. You could have a different zone for every road. I think the idea behind having a larger zonal area again would be a little bit lower cost for future development because For instance, you saw the numbers on Virtue Road. That's a very expensive road, a lot of different issues with constructing that. So because of that, that would probably be the most expensive road to develop on versus another one that's probably more in keeping with, say, a Union Road or maybe even an Everett Road that we just repaired and improved. So that's the difference, and that's probably why if you see a clustering of roads too, they all connect. Virtue connects to Boyd Station together, and that's really the growth area of the town. Most likely going forward, with a couple other exceptions, which are all shown here on the map.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a real quick question about how you come up with I read it and I know it just kind of went through my eyeballs and out my brain again. If you don't know how many dwelling units you're going to be building in a particular area, how do you come up with the amount per dwelling unit?
We did, like with Everett Road, we did an estimate based on the land use, so there were some assumptions. So if you look at that ordinance on the bottom, it talks about those assumptions.
Okay.
So we assumed that 70% of that, whatever was left over, would be developable. 30% of that would be open space or just environmentally sensitive areas. So we use that 70%. So then we can kind of determine how many units we can get in there based on whether it's multi-family, single family, and so forth. So we just kind of made those assumptions
All right.
and based the formula off that.
Based on current zoning?
The future
Land
land
use.
Oh, land use.
Future land
Okay.
use.
I've got a question as to why was our estimate so far off on the Everett Road project?
The estimate wasn't off. We had Split Rail Farm, which we did a contract cost share agreement with. And then Mr. Money came in and we did we did the Everett Road corridor improvement fee. His development went from Smith Road up to the entrance to the subdivision. I'm sorry, help me with this, David. He's right in the middle of the road, so there was
Yeah,
different factors.
the $1.8 million is the cost to go from Smith Road to the north to the entrance to Split Rail Farm. That Everett Road project went all the way down to Union Road, so it was actually a little longer and a bigger project. That's why the $3.2 million is the total cost for that project.
Yeah, I remember now.
The numbers were right, we charge differently.
Can you remind me, the corridor fee for Everett Road, it didn't cover the entirety of Everett Road, just to Split Rail? Just to...
It covers from Split Rail Farm down to Smith Road, and it includes all the properties that are in and around that Everett Road area. Some would be fronting Everett Road, some would be just off. They're all possibility of being developable properties in the future.
I've got the 5 questions you put up there earlier, 4 or 5 that you want answers to. Do we need to?
That is Gary.
I think it was at the end, next to the last slide.
Yes, sir.
Do we need to give you those answers today, or?
You don't have to give them to us today, but if you have any feedback, any comments, any direction on things you like or don't like, or things you'd like us to go back and reconsider or do further analysis on, then certainly that's going to help us in taking this forward. I can see us having a series of more workshops on this item in the future. We just need to get some direction from the board on how you'd like to continue to go down that path.
Explain again, please, the difference between corridor and townwide.
Yeah. So basically, Mayor, if we do the corridor approach, we're going to be using those benefit zones, which in that picture is the blue bubble. So each one of these circles includes the roads, and that's the potential benefit zone. So the way we would calculate that is we would take the total cost of the roads within that zone and then divide it by the new trips per day and get the trip cost, and then multiply that by the dwelling units based on the land use. So when you're looking at the two different approaches, you're talking about service area. So the study the impact fees will require us to determine the service area. And you can either do a service area based on the zonal approach, which is what we have here in front of you, or you can do it town-wide, which makes the service area town-wide. So if you're taking funds from a development on one side of town, you can use those funds for improvements on the other side of town, since the service area is town-wide. If you did the zonal approach, you could only use those funds derived from the benefit zone to go back into that benefit zone.
So if you have a subdivision that's 250 homes and there's 3 empty lots, you would then, if you went with the town zone, town-wide, you would charge that builder a fee for that one lot
Yes.
in that established neighborhood.
Assuming that you
If we adopt
adopted it that way,
provisions.
yes.
And
assuming-
then the other way, the zone, if there's a large bubble in the bottom there, which is Virtue Road, Evans Road, that fee could be different than the fee up there for Boring
Oh,
Road.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm just doing a rough estimate. Allen, Kirby, Evans, Virtue, and Boyd Station combined is like $26 million.
A lot of money.
Right.
Half of our total.
That's why I was asking if they could be broken up into smaller zones. But then it would be, certain roads would be higher, is what you're saying.
Correct.
I think the consultant, again, when he ran the analysis on this early on, he was looking at, from the zonal approach, it was going to cost, probably over $10,000 per dwelling unit for an impact fee based on the zonal approach. That's why he looked at this, but he didn't spend a lot of analysis time trying to determine what that would be, knowing what those costs are. So instead, he looked at the town-wide approach, which again reduced that cost down to roughly $4,000 per dwelling unit. But that would be, as Gary's mentioned, town-wide for all properties, all new developments going forward. So that's the main difference between the two. If the board was interested in looking further at the corridor approach, then we would need to go back and do quite a bit of analysis on each of the corridors and try to determine how that would all fit in and what shape that would look like.
Let me ask you, how, we're getting some assistance on Union Road. How does that come into play with this? If in the future we get, that's a big if, but never say never, it's happening now.
Well, again, we mentioned earlier, this is based on $52 million of road improvements if we did every single one of them right now. So this is probably a 20 to probably 30-year time frame that we're looking at doing these roadways. If we can do them sooner, then certainly we'll try to do them sooner. It's just a matter of funding and how much we have available each year to put toward roads. One thing we certainly can do is look at if the funding coming in is greater than what we're putting out, then we can certainly reduce fees at any time going forward. I don't think, again, Union Road, Mr. Smith did a great job of getting us some initial funding for that roadway. We're still looking at whether or not we get funding for the construction of it, which we have not received that yet. But many of these other roads, again, are more local in nature, and we may not be able to get much grant funding for them. Can you go back to those questions? We'll go back to the question slide again, just for everybody to get back to some of the major issues. So obviously the corridor, the town-wide approach is going to be a big decision factor if we want to go with either of those approaches. And then also I think the major one is, do we want to just look at residential, or do you also want to look at commercial, office, those different aspects of things as well? And then again, the platted lots that are already out there. We have several subdivisions that are already underway around town. So do we want to, whenever, if this gets adopted and when it gets adopted, then do we want to start that process at that point, or do you want to basically grandfather those lots in for not having to pay? So a lot of different considerations. Anytime you take, the main thing I want to make the board aware of, anytime you say you take something away, that just means that there's additional burden and payment that the town will have to pick up on down the road whenever we do those projects. So the analysis that Clancy did with Duncan Associates, we would just have to be tweaking those numbers quite a bit based on all the calculations that he has done.
The question I have is, in the past, we have not charged any fee for commercial, is that correct?
I know commercial has had to do deceleration lanes. They've had to do improvements to roads. There's no doubt about it. I think, in fact, they had to do a lot of the improvements in Turkey Creek to the roadways in that area. So, no, the commercial has done work throughout the town, but we haven't had a necessary fee based on that, just as we haven't necessarily had a fee for residential either.
I don't see where, in any of these zones, that you'd have commercial.
There is some commercial in the Virtue Road area that it showed. Not Virtue Road. Gary, can you go back to that map? Boring Road certainly is got a large commercial node there. North Campbell Station Road has some commercial property that is in that area as well.
It's undeveloped?
In the North Campbell Station area, yes, sir. There's quite a bit of area up there north of the interstate that is undeveloped. And then there's some commercial there in the Everett Road, Union Road corridor area. Obviously, that's not done either. That's commercial. Could potentially be commercial, but isn't.
Commercial. The churches over there are zoned
Yes.
commercial that are sandwiched between Kingston Pike and Union Road.
Oh, the back side, okay.
Okay.
Right, on Union Road.
Your two largest commercial zones would be the Boring Road area, which is mostly developed, but it could redevelop. You'd have those issues. And then the area north of Campbell Station, or on North Campbell Station, north of I-40. Any other questions that the board has at this time?
I don't have any other questions, but I certainly have a comment. I just want to say that I'm very disappointed that a town with these resources and the level of talent and ability is even considering such a retrograde, barely legal, discriminatory form of taxation that assumes that development is evil and must be punished, and will ensure that it will take much longer for the town to finally get built out at great expense to the landowners and the people who are actually trying to build it. And when you penalize something, you decrease it. And what we'll see is slower development. This thing, at the rate the town is developing now, we're looking at a 1% increase in population. It'll take 30 or 40 years. If we impose this tax, it'll take even longer to raise this money, which by the time we ever get around to getting these roads built will cost twice as much. So I think this is a waste of time. We really need to be focusing on increasing our revenues through more viable and equally shared means, and looking at how we're spending our money. Because I think we have the resources to improve these roads without unduly burdening one small sector of town. And there's a whole bunch of people here, I think, today that share my feelings about that. So that's my input to staff. I like to throw this in the wastebasket.
Well, if the rest of the board feels that way, then we can do that. That's just, we're taking it to you for your consideration. Mayor, we've got about 5 more minutes until we would need to break before the board meeting. Would you like just a few minutes for any comments that the public may have at this time?
Sure.
Okay. If anybody has any comments, we've got about, again, I say 5 minutes, so I don't want to tell you that we have to cut you off, but we will in about 5-6 minutes. And if you would, just state your name and who you are for the record. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll be brief. My name is Russ Rackley, P.O. Box 3456, Knoxville. I'm here representing Saddlebrook Properties, who has many lots already platted and on the ground, and obviously this is of grave concern to us. We strategically pick projects that economically are viable, and part of that economic viability is the access. If we have to fund 2, 3, 5, 10 miles of road improvement, then the land we can't pay as much for the land, or else it drives the housing cost up above what the market will bear. But just some quick math on your $52 million, if you had a $5,000 per lot townwide impact fee, you would need 10,400 permits to come up with that amount of money. Now, all of your current single-family detached zoning, R1, 2, and 3, even though they state different densities, because of the dimensional constraints on the lot dimensions themselves, they're all pinned at around 2.2 units an acre. So that means you need 5,200 acres to develop for single-family detached to generate the amount of money to pay that $52 million, and that's just not ever going to happen. There's not that much land left to develop in the town of Farragut. A couple of other things just to note. As a licensed professional engineer, I will never argue against safety. If a road is too narrow and dangerous or too curvy and dangerous, then there need to be improvements made for safety. But these dollar figures aren't just improving road safety. They're building an 80-foot wide corridor that would be great for the town and the townspeople, with the activity trail on one side and the walking trail on the other side, and curb and gutters and storm drainage that don't currently exist. The town's burden and the burden on future residents that will be paying this welcome to Farragut tax, the increased cost on a house here versus over in Hardin Valley for the exact same house, would be lessened if we focused more on roads that need to be improved in width or in sight distance from a safety perspective, and not for the town's vision of the walking trails and activity trails and everything, which I'm not knocking it. It's great. But if you don't have the funding vehicles in place, to the revenue stream in place to construct and maintain these things, then it's impractical, as we see. You don't have 5,000 acres to develop. You would have to take the several hundred acres of vacant land and approve apartments on them to generate the number of units to get the revenue you need to fund that $52 million, which I guess would be reduced some with the recent 80% funding from TDOT on Union Road. I don't know what phase of funding that is. I wasn't involved in that, obviously, but maybe those would be
Real quick
adjusted.
question.
Yes.
The numbers you're using, are you assuming that the developers are funding 100% of the future road projects?
No, that's assuming a $5,000 per lot, which in the study that your consultants did.
Then that $5,000 per lot, it goes to $51 million.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
In the report, it says if we delete commercial development, we are looking at the impact fees would generate about 51% of the revenue needed to fund the improvements. So we're looking at almost an even split.
Right.
And please don't take this as I have an opinion here.
Right.
I'm just
No,
trying
I'm
to
not.
get to the right number.
Right.
as
So
far
you would
as-
need 10,000 acres developed
Okay,
then.
so that's-
So, right, to pay the full amount. I was just based on the meetings that staff was gracious enough to have with the public and the concerned industry people and citizens. The number was $44-something thousand per lot was the townwide impact fee that they came up with. So just rounding it to 5,000 and the 50, just trying to use simple math for conversation purposes. My point is you don't have enough land left to generate even the new development share of the cost of doing these roads. So because there's not, somebody can help me here. I know we've got 80 acres, the Ivy Track's 100 acres, Schubert's got 150 acres, Thompson's got, I think, about 170 acres of their 400 is actually in Knox County in the town of Farragut. The rest is in Loudon. So there's not that much acreage left. And at the 2.2 units per acre, you're just not ever going to get there. I think that's really all that I wanted to say. I mean, I know y'all have negotiated cost shares in the past with developers, but your example of Split Rail Farm is on its third owner now. The first two owners, banks, took the hit of the loss and sold it at hoc for the next person because it was unbearable. We are fortunate that with our McKinley Station project, although the sales aren't as quick in there thus far as they are on our other two projects on Turkey Creek Road, that it looks like it may be a viable project, even with an impact fee that is almost twice what the negotiated fee with Split Rail Farm was. So I just think that y'all need to take a longer look at what, I applaud your vision of the town of Farragut, and I applaud your standards for the town of Farragut. But with great standards and a great town comes the responsibility of finances. I mean, you have to have the revenue to create it and to maintain it. We just the company that I represent have built dozens and dozens of miles of asphalt greenway trails that are going to have to be repaved at some point, that the town is going to have to repave at some point, not to mention all the roads we've created that are going to have to be maintained, and et cetera, et cetera. And you know, the alternative is not to have it at all, because we all need something, and it's a wonderful town. But at the same time, we're fighting too to try to figure out how to make the town more accessible to young families, college graduates, newlyweds with young children that don't have the family resources to subsidize their housing choice and allow them to live in Farragut, because there's nothing affordable in the town of Farragut. So by driving the cost of housing up, you're making it more and more difficult for people younger in their life, or single people, divorcees, or what have you, to enjoy the benefits of your town. So you're getting closer and closer to being very one-dimensional as a community. So I'll stop there because I know I only had 5 minutes. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Mayor and Board, we do need to break to get ready for our board meeting here in just a few minutes, but I did want to let everybody know that we'll be discussing this more in future workshops. We'll have more time for public comment and things like that in the future. This was just, again, to kind of reinitiate the discussion of this and see where the board would like to go. So as soon as we have those, we'll get the word out to you and let you know so we can get you here. So thank you very much, and we'll get started here in just a couple minutes with the board meeting.